Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we've got another fountain pen related video. This is going to be a test of Noodler's Fox Red ink. This is a sample that I got from Goulet Pens. This Fox Red is a ink that is advertised as being both a bulletproof ink, so waterproof, and eternal ink, so light fast and fade resistant. I'm going to be doing the writing samples today with this Jinhao Model 80 that is got an extra fine nib, and I'm going to be writing on 5 different papers. That's going to be a 20-pound copy paper, a Pen Gear composition notebook, a 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper, a 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. I mostly use my pens and my inks for drawing purposes, therefore my paper selection is more of an artist selection for paper, not necessarily what most maybe most fountain pen users would use for daily writing tasks, but being as how, like I said, I use my pens for art, these are the types of papers that I typically use. And also, due to me using my papers for art, that is the reason why I typically tend to favor inks that are waterproof and light fast, so that should I use an ink in an art piece, I know that over time the color vibrancy, hues of those inks will stand the test of time if that piece were to be framed and displayed. So without further ado, we're going to move on to our writing tests. And for our first writing test, we have the 20-pound copy paper. Alright, that concludes the writing test with the 20-pound copy paper. Now, looking at the paper, I really don't see any signs of feathering or any kind of growing on the page. On this copy paper, this writes like an extra fine. Sometimes on copy paper, because of the absorbency, inks tend to grow on the copy paper and can write broader than the nib of the pen that you would normally associate with a particular nib size of pen, but this ink seems to be very well behaved on even this pretty absorbent copy paper. Now you can see in the 10-second smear on the copy paper, it looks like we have some slight smearing on the final line there, so on the copy paper within about a second, we are dry on the copy paper here. And now you will see that where I tried to put more ink down on the scrub here, I did get a slight smear. So, but all in all, it seems to be quite fast drying on this paper, and you know, maybe not necessarily going down the wettest, but like I said, this is an extra fine nib. Now onto the back of the copy paper, you'll see that this Fox Brown is not really ghosting or bleeding very much at all. There are some slight hints of some ghosting, but from what I can see on this copy paper, you could easily use both sides of this sheet of paper with this ink and this extra fine nib. Perhaps with a broader or wetter nib, you might witness some bleed or ghost that would cause issues with using both sides of the paper, but from what I can see with this extra fine nib, you would be good to go to use this ink on both sides of this paper. And so that concludes the sample, the drawing test with the 20-pound copy paper. Our next paper is going to be the Pen Gear composition notebook. And now here we are writing in the Pen Gear composition notebook. All right. And that concludes writing with in the composition notebook. Now, once again, looking at this, just as with the copy paper, I don't see any signs of feathering. I don't see any signs of this wanting to spread or grow on the page. This went down like you would expect from an extra fine. I don't really see any ill effects from the ink. Now I will say this, I'm not really seeing much anything in the way of shading. That was very much the case with the copy paper as well. But it looks like it's performing very well on this paper. Actually, one of the better performing inks that I've seen on copy paper, or excuse me, on this notebook paper. As you can see on the smear here, it looks like we started smearing on the 4th line. So some of that ink was still wet after about 6 seconds on this paper. Towards the end of the stroke, most of it almost seems to have going to about the 3rd line. So after about 3 seconds, the majority of the ink was dry. Only where the end of the stroke, where the ink was put down heavier on the paper, was it still wet for about 6 seconds. And you can see the scrub and smear there. It was still fairly wet, flowing pretty good on this paper out of this extra fine nib. Now onto the back of the page. There are no bleed spots and really no ghosting. Nothing. It's perfectly fine. You could very much, like, it'd be no problem using both sides of this paper with this ink. Now, perhaps, maybe with a broader nib, you might see a little bit of ghosting. I doubt you would really see any bleeds, though, just from based on what I'm seeing. Maybe some ghosting. But I think even because nothing really seems to be coming through at all on this paper, I believe you could probably get away with a broader nib on this type of notebook paper. That's actually some very good performance compared to some of the inks that I've seen. So that concludes our drawing sample, or our writing sample, and the composition notebook. Our next paper is going to be the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. And now here is the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright, that concludes our writing sample on the Blick 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper. Now, once again, I am seeing that there is no feathering, there is no aggressive growing or expansion on the page. Maybe, perhaps, with this paper, I might be seeing a little bit of shading on the ends of some of the pen strokes. Not much. It's just barely noticeable. From a distance, like if you're not right up on the paper under a bright light like I am right now, you probably wouldn't notice it. If you're just normally reading something you had wrote or something that somebody else had wrote, you probably wouldn't notice the shading, not on this paper. But there's a little bit, not a lot. You can see on the smear here, really after about 3 seconds, it looks like it's almost dry. It looks like maybe there's a slight smear coming from this 4th line. So I don't know if that line went down a little wetter than the ones that followed it, but really the smears start on about the 3rd to the last line. So about 3 seconds, and you can see the smear there from the scrub. Now, of the 3 art papers that I have, this is the most absorbent, least ink friendly of the 3 art papers that I'm testing today. So I expect to see better performance on the next 2 papers, but that being said, this is just fine. This is perfectly fine from what I can see. And on the back of the page, like I said, this is a 50-pound paper, but there is absolutely nothing. I mean, unless I hold this, I can't even see that anything's written on the top side where these inks. This ink is right through here, and there's nothing. There's no indicator that there is anything written on the front side of this paper. Unless you had a light on the back side shining through the page, you can't tell that there's anything on the reverse side of this paper. Now, With an art paper like this, you generally don't use both sides. You draw something on one side and you want that to be seen, so the back side is just left because the front side would be displayed. But, you know, in case there was a reason to be using some other 50-pound paper, you know, it might be relevant to see that what you could expect on a paper of this weight. So with that one having been done, we're going to move on to the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. And now here we are with the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. Alright, and that concludes our writing on the Koh-i-Noor 50-pound sketch paper. Now, once again, there is no kinds of feathering and no kinds of growing on the page. It is exactly what I expect to see out of an extra fine nib as far as line weight here. There are, like I said, some hints of some shading, but only really this close under a bright light. For the most part, you know, if this is sitting on the table and you're writing, you know, sitting upright at a normal distance, it's going to look fairly monotoned. This isn't, I wouldn't really consider this to be a shading ink. At least not with this extra fine nib. Perhaps with a broader nib you might see more, but compared to some of the other inks that I've tested, I would not really consider this to be a shading ink. Now you can see on the 10-second smear test, starting with the second line here, so that is 9 seconds. And it's still wet on this paper. Now this is not a very absorbent paper at all. Ink, even some of the inks that I have that are less, you know, not as well behaved on a lot of papers, generally handle or work quite well on this paper here. So, like I said, I did not expect to see any kind of strange, you know, performance on this paper. And I fully did expect to see this ink last a little, you know, not dry quite as quickly. And as you can see from the smear, we did get quite a bit of a smear. The ink was not that dry. And, you know, wetness with this particular nib is pretty decent for an extra fine. And onto the back here, like I said, this is not an absorbent paper whatsoever. In fact, none of the inks that I have tested on this paper in this particular test and in the prior tests I've done in the past, I don't know that I've ever actually had any inks bleed through on this paper. Now for a 50-pound paper, this is actually quite thin. It has a feeling almost like a parchment paper to a certain degree. It just has to do with the formulation of the paper itself. But with that having been said, that is the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Our last paper is going to be the 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And here is our final paper, the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Alright, and there's the drawing, or the writing on the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. Pick it up. So, kind of like with that Koh-i-Noor, the Canson here is not an absorbent paper whatsoever. This is a mixed media paper. It's meant to handle a little bit of everything. That includes some watercolors, alcohol, inks, acrylics, fountain pen inks, India ink, Chinese ink, dry media, pastels, you know, so I did not expect to see it perform poorly or be absorbent, you know. So some of the feathering and more characteristics of harmful or sort of negative absorption kind of situation with this paper. None of that. It performed pretty much the same as performed in almost every paper in this test. This ink, you you know, this paper here is sort of the best case scenario for an ink, but even with the technically the worst case scenarios like the copy paper, this ink has been performing amazingly. In fact, this seems to be one of my most tolerant inks that I've ever tested, as far as the inks that I own. The only ink that I would say maybe gives this one a run for its money, as far as its tolerance on pretty much every paper surface, is my Legal Blue, the Noodler's Legal Blue. That is kind of my go-to ink for writing on, you know, when I don't know what kind of paper I'm going to be writing on. Now, on the smear test, this ink looks to have smeared on almost every line. Maybe that first line might have been dry, but pretty much there is some ink smearing on pretty much every line. So even after 10 seconds, we look to still be wet on this paper. And like I said, this is not at all an absorbent paper. This usually happens with most inks on this paper, except for some of the more aggressive, very fast drying inks that I've tested. Usually you see most all the lines smear here on this paper. And you can see the scrub there. The scrub was still very much wet when I smeared my finger across this paper. So, and as far as on the back, this is a 98-pound paper. I have never had a single ink bleed through this paper. It is like I said, a non-absorbent 98-pound paper, and it's about the thickness of a piece of cardstock. So, I didn't expect to see anything on the back, and there is nothing on the back. So that concludes our writing test. Now we're going to look at the chromatography that I did. Now here is my poor man's chromatography. I'm calling this a poor man's chromatography because, well, I used a paper towel for this because I didn't have any other filter paper on hand when I made this chromatography. Now, this, I put down a line of ink. I dipped this in a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water that was mixed at about a 30% ratio. And you can see the initial line of ink is very much there. A lot of that did not want to move. Now, it did fade some when I put it in the alcohol solution. It's kind of a little bit of, I don't know how it's going to show up on camera, but it's kind of like a magenta. It seems like there's a hint of pink here. You can see this sort of orange and yellow as it rises up the page, or up the paper here. And there's a lot of red in this area. A lot of the red has traveled, almost made this band sort of in the middle, where then it goes back to that orange and yellow that you see once again down here. Now disregard these couple of drops. That was some accidental ink drops that ended up on the paper when I was making the chromatography, so that was my mistake. And it made it pretty high up the paper, which is kind of surprising too. But you can kind of see the colors that we have here. Some magenta, orange, yellow, and then that very much sort of red, flame red color. Now, I know that this is not the best example of a chromatography due to the paper use, and if you had a more proper filter paper, you would likely potentially see the colors and potentially color components within the ink. But for what it's worth, here is my poor man's chromatography. And now we're going to do a quick water test. This is a scrap of 20-pound copy paper. I'm going to draw a little grid on this copy paper. I'm going to wait 30 seconds, and then I'm going to take this pipette, drip water on that grid, wait another 10 seconds, rub the water in, and then dab that water off with a tissue. And then we'll see if any ink lifts or runs on the page. Now, I am actually quite surprised by this. You can see we actually did have ink movement and lifted some ink on the page, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see too well, but there is actually sort of a cloud of pinkish hue around this, where some of this ink did move on the paper. This surprises me because I believe that the Fox Red here, this is supposed to be one of Noodler's more, very permanent inks, my understanding is. I think specifically, though, this ink is meant more to be a very light, fast ink. So I am a little bit surprised, especially considering that this ink seems like it was wanting to dry quite quickly. I am kind of surprised that the ink did move. Now, this isn't the most definitive water resistance test possible, because I know with a lot of these inks, like these Noodler's inks, sometimes that water resistance or waterproofness comes after the ink has been allowed to fully bond with the paper, which can take some time, in some cases hours, for it to fully bond and get the, its full potential for permanence in terms of water resistance. So, now that being said, it did move. We got a little bit of ink smear on the page. Some ink lifted off. That being said, most of the ink is still on the paper, and if you were, say, writing something with this ink and something spilled on it, at least from this test, just this quick drip test here, that within 30 seconds or so, if water dripped onto your page, it would not move it or disturb it to the point that you would lose whatever you had written or drawn with the ink on the paper. Obviously, if, say, you didn't dab it off, you'll probably get more of a ink smear and staining around the writing than what I got in this case, but it would still be legible. Whatever you put on the page would still be legible. So, like I said, kind of surprised, though, that I got some ink to lift. And it wasn't just like lifting towards the edges. It lifted pretty much consistently from that sample. So, like I said, kind of surprising. Now, I am doing a longer test here also with the papers that I tested on today. I'm going to take the Blick drawing paper, the Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and the Canson mixed media paper. I'm going to use them for a longer running light fastness test. I'm going to take those papers, I'm going to tape them up to the glass of a window on the south side of my house, where they're going to receive, pretty much be in full view of the sun and receive pretty much constant direct sunlight for a full month, so 30 days. And after those 30 days, I'll bring those back in and I'll have a comparison video between between what they looked like before they went up, what they look like when they come down, and I will also compare them to the writing samples on the copy paper, which will not be exposed to that sunlight. So that is a test that you can look forward to seeing in the future, being that light fastness test. But as far as my overall thoughts on this ink, the performance on pretty much every paper, though, in terms of the way it reacted on every paper surface that I tried it on, this has been one of the most tolerant inks actually that I have tested. It worked great on every paper that I wrote on it with. It didn't bleed, it didn't ghost, it didn't feather, it didn't grow. It was an extra fine line on every paper, even the most absorbent papers that that I tried, that being the two cheap papers. And while I was a little bit surprised to see the ink did move in my quick water resistance test, it's still, at the very least, water resistant. It didn't just completely wash off of the paper. So, it's still to be seen how it handles in the light fastness test. Now, in the past, with the other Noodler's inks that I've tested, because I've done light fastness testing before, the ones that were claimed to be eternal did in fact turn out to be eternal inks. They did not fade. So I'm pretty certain I can probably believe the claims of this being a light fast ink I doubt I'm going to see any surprises in that test. But time will tell whether that's true or not. And with having all that been said, if you have watched the video to this point, I thank you. And if you thought that it was informative and you gained some information by watching and listening, I would ask that you please hit the like button down there. That would really help me out. And if you have any questions about this ink, or if you have any questions or comments about the way that I did my ink test here, or maybe you have suggestions or criticisms of the way I presented my information in this video, all of those things are helpful. And if you drop a comment down there, I do check my comment section. At this point, I don't get a lot of comments, so when I do get comments, I will read them, and I usually do reply back to them. Or maybe you're somebody that has used this ink. You can go down there in the comment section and share your experience with this ink. If you've had extensive use and experience with it, because that would not only help me out, but it will help out anybody else that might venture down there into the comment section and read those comments. And also, if you've watched this video, and maybe you've watched some of my other videos, you think I do a pretty good job presenting the information and the way that I try to present the information, and you think that I do a decent job in making my videos, I would also appreciate a subscription. That would help me out, help to grow the channel. And with having all of that been said, I thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again on the next one. Bye.